So this time I think I'm going to do a little audio commentary on top of having the music and little text blurbs to explain what's going on. Um, just because of the way my recording situation's set up, it's easier for me to do the commentary after the fact rather than while I'm recording. My camera doesn't actually record sound very well. So what you're seeing here is me cleaning up the mold and getting it ready to open up. I had planned to remove the hot glue off the bottom, but was fighting me a little bit more than I wanted, so I just said screw it and peeled the mold open normally. What I ended up using to make that mold tube is actually the plastic from a bleach wipe container. I actually prefer doing this because it allows me to sort of spiral it into the size I want, as opposed to buying tubes of a specific size and having it be too big or too small. Or the other alternative is making a box every time, which that can actually end up wasting material just in the corners. So being able to sort of dial in a circular mold at any size I want just by having a little double-sided tape in there works wonders for me. So here I'm just peeling away all of the little bits of paper and stuff that was left over from the foam cord that I use as the base. Right here you can see the little foam plug I used to kind of raise up the figure. Took a little bit of sculpey with it, but that's not the end of the world. For one, that's on the bottom of the figure, and it's not going to affect the casting process at all. But unfortunately, I sort of overestimated the stretchiness of the Illumilite High Strength 3, and it ended up not quite releasing the figure right away. I was hoping to have this just as all one piece and not having to cut it open, but as you can kind of see, I'm having some trouble figuring out how I open this thing up and how I go about removing it. So what I end up doing after toying with it for a while and sort of seeing how much give and stretch it has, which this has a lot more than the, I believe it was Smooth On Umu 30 is what I was using before. This is a fairly good silicone. I have no problems with using it. It's just this stuff is stretchier and a little softer, and it has certain qualities that Umu doesn't. But yeah, it turned out that no matter what I did, the only way I was getting this thing out of there was to open up the mold, which I ended up doing with a little zigzag registration cut down the side, which should happen in just a moment. But instead of having to open the mold all the way, I kind of took my time and did it a little bit at a time, just because that allowed me to sort of have the minimal amount of seam lining on the castings. So I would go a little bit and then see if I could pull it out, and then unfortunately I had to go a little bit further. Luckily this is all on fairly unimportant pieces of the actual figure, so it's no big deal. But this is just sort of part of the process of figuring out how this new mold is going to work. And it actually does end up having less of a seam and causing less problems in the original mold. So that's a good thing in the long run. But yeah, after doing all of that, it's just a matter of getting a good grip on the figure and wiggling it loose. Part of the reason I used the Illumilite silicone in the first place was because it dealt very nicely with overhangs and sort of complex shapes, which Goblin Slayer's kind of sticking out every which way. His shield's out to the side, and that's sort of got corners and crevices in it, so I needed something that would get into all of those crevices, but also stretch enough that it wouldn't rip every time I pulled out a resin casting. And right here you can just see me cleaning out the mold and sort of touching it up, just because all kinds of the little bits of stuff, the residue from the mold release, anything that broke off when his legs snapped there, which those just pop right back into place. That was something I was aware of when I originally started working on it, was the legs had broken once before and I had to glue them back in before painting them and prepping them for the mold, so no worry there. But yeah, with all of that situated, I'm just sort of testing out the mold. It was still a little sticky at this point. I probably could have given it more time to fully cure, but it didn't actually cause any problems. But now that's all done, it's time to move on to the resin. Smoothcast 300 is, of the few resins I've worked with, it's my favorite. Mixes in a 1-to-1 ratio and turns out some really professional looking, bright white, clean results. The kit I'm using here is a little bit older, so the part A is a little bit more white than it should be, but I don't think that's a problem, at least not in this case. If you do leave 2-part resins, kits like this, on the shelf for too long, they can go bad and become unusable. You'll get some really wonky results, but this isn't so bad that it interfered with what I was doing, and I knew it was an older kit, so I'm alright with this being my first test pull on this mold. In this case, I poured out each of the parts separately into 2 different containers and then joined them into one larger container. Typically I'm working with smaller amounts of resin, so I just mix them in the same cup. So this is just so I can more easily mix up a larger batch at once. A lot of the instructions and tutorials out there will tell you to do the same thing, measure them in separate cups and then pour them together, which is a good idea. It gives you a chance to make sure your measurements are right before you're pouring everything and then can't remove them. There's no easy way to separate the 2-part resin once it's started to mix. So doing it this way is a little safer, but there's no real issue with mixing them up in the same cup. It's just in this case I had a larger amount to mix than I could do in the little 1 fluid ounce cups. So they go in the 3rd disposable paper cup, and it's just a simple matter of mixing it quickly, scraping the sides, making sure there's nothing sort of gathered at the bottom, and then pouring that into your mold. Although this can actually be a good thing to do, mixing smaller batches and pouring a little bit at a time, sort of depending on what you're working on. Just because pouring too much at once can easily put you in a situation where the resin starts to harden and become a little bit more gummy and syrupy before you've really had a chance to get it into all of the fine details and crevices of your mold. So with this one, it turned out I needed pretty much exactly 3 fluid ounces to fill the mold, and I only mixed 2 at first. You'll see in just a moment I mix another ounce or so. But mixing a little bit at a time gives you the extra little bit of breathing room you need to rotate the mold to make sure no huge air bubbles are getting trapped in there, and that it's not either overflowing your mold or anything like that. Even if you know exactly how much the mold takes, if you do your calculations and your measurements and all that, it's still better sometimes just to mix up a little bit at a time and take your time with it, which will make more sense once you've worked with this material enough. The hardening time on Smoothcast 300 isn't too bad. Like I said, it's about 5 minutes before it really starts to turn into a more syrupy substance, and when you count in mix time, pour time, as you can see here, taking the time to sort of roll it around, tap out the air bubbles, which is what I'm doing here with the file handle. You don't really want to be taking the time, or rather wasting the time, pouring in a little bit of resin, rolling it around, pouring in a little bit more, because your stuff's going to be quickly starting to set on you. So doing little batches gives you the time to mix up a little bit, pour it in there, roll it around, get all the air bubbles out, and make sure that's setting right before you go and mix up a little bit more, as opposed to, say, mixing up several ounces all at once and having an entire batch go to waste on you because you couldn't prep and pour it all quickly enough and make sure that the whole process was going well enough. Unfortunately, with the Smoothcast resin, and with a lot of the resins I've worked with, it will bond to itself even if it's already started to harden, which if you look right in the video, you can see inside the mold it's starting to turn a little bit white, and that is the hardening process taking place. So, as I was saying, you can pour resin right onto resin and have it start to mix together, even if they're in kind of two different states Like if one's a little bit hard and the other one's just freshly mixed, pouring them right onto each other can work out just fine. Might not be recommended with all kinds of resins or epoxies or anything like that, but for smooth cast, it works no problem. It bonds to itself. Even if one of the parts is completely hardened, you can just add more resin in there and have it come together as one solid piece. And unless your resins mix very poorly or there's something contaminating it, you will not notice like a color difference between them, which means the piece will look like one solid, cohesive piece of resin. But yeah, I think here we're just going to do a little bit more tapping, a little bit more cleaning up. On the side, I'm just sort of making sure all of my little measuring cups are dumping into the same container so it's a little easier to clean out. Giving this a few more taps just to get the air bubbles out. And then there's one more thing I'm going to do, which is to kind of scrape the inner rim. There's a little lip inside there where air bubbles can get trapped. And even though it's on the bottom of the piece, it's still something that you just kind of want to get out there. You don't want air bubbles. But one technique I have found that helps, and one technique I should have done on this one, was overestimating the quality of my mold a little bit too much. What I discovered before is if you take a power sander, not a big one, just one of the little small palm sanders, and you hold the mold in one hand, hold the power sander to the bottom of the mold, and vibrate the crap out of it, it helps loosen up a lot of the air bubbles, and what it'll actually do is wiggle the resin into all of those really fine crevices. So if there are air bubbles on the outside of your mold, it'll pull the resin into those. So instead of having a little hollow divot, you'll have like a little bubble of plastic that you can just chip off and clean up instead of having it ruined. And one more thing here, just because I think it does kind of matter. Smooth cast only really takes about 5 minutes. Once it's started to go white like this, it's pretty much hard and good to go. You can pull it right out of the mold and it'll look fine. It won't like turn to mush on you. The only problem is it retains heat for a while. Not enough to burn or hurt you, but it's better to let it cool down naturally, just because while it is still curing and while it is still holding heat, it's a little soft. And what can actually happen is you'll go in there, reach and touch your piece, and you will deform it ever so slightly. So like with the sword on this Goblin Slayer statuette, what can end up happening is you can pull it out, and while pulling it out, you're putting pressure on that sword or on the edge of the shield, and that warps and bends and distorts those, and then it's going to cool more quickly because it's in the open air, and you'll have a piece that's just warped. And as far as I know, you can't, say, take a heat gun or a lighter to it to warm it up again. It doesn't really work that way. Once the chemical reaction's done, it's done. So it helps sometimes to have a little patience and just let it sit. And it also helps to have patience while you're pulling it out here. It's like I mentioned before, this has a lot of overhangs, so you don't want to put so much force and pressure on the mold that you start ripping it or damaging other pieces of it, because that'll then affect each future pull that you do with it. And right here, I'm just sort of giving it the once over, checking it to make sure, and honestly, for a first pull, I was very happy with this. I've had far worse results. Here, really quick, I'm just cleaning up the work table before I start doing some sawing. The little piece on the bottom is kind of a sprue. It's just there to make sure that I get enough resin into the mold to fill that thing all the way up to the base, and not to have like a hollow cavity on the bottom or a sort of incomplete fill where it would be at an angle or unlevel. And of course, I'm just hitting it with a sanding sponge just to clean it up. Arguably, the bottom of the piece doesn't really matter so much, but it also helps just to make sure that it's, yet again, sitting level and straight and looks clean and professional. These are steps you should take for your own sake. But all that really remains here is the cleaning up process, which, as you'll see, I'll grab my trusty needle files and just go to town cleaning out the little bit of resin from between the legs. When I cast this guy, I put a little bit of cardboard between there, just so it would create a gap in the mold. just so I wouldn't have to, say, wiggle a razor blade in there to try and cut that overhang out, because the resin, or rather the silicone, would fill in there. And it's kind of it's a tricky spot to cut out, especially when you have a big flat base right above it. So I decided to sort of preempt that by just blocking it off so the silicone doesn't meet in the middle there. But that does, of course, mean that I have to clean it out once it's done. So that's all I'm doing here, is just sort of going over it, cleaning out any sprue marks or any casting errors, and this is just the sort of final steps before painting and detailing and all that. Since this was the first one, oop, dropped my tool there. Since this was the first one I pulled from the mold, I also wanted it to look kind of nice and, you know, be able to be proud of my work here, because I do like to keep the first pull off a mold just as a little trophy to my accomplishments. Here I'm cleaning up the seam lines on the legs from where I cut the mold, and going over it and checking if any areas where the air bubbles might get in there, because what can happen is you'll get air bubbles right underneath sort of the skin of the resin, and they won't show up right away, but you can easily kind of poke through with the tool. But yeah, that's kind of the whole process. You saw me make the mold, you saw me pull it open, you saw me cast from it. If you got questions, I guess leave a comment. If you like what I do, I'm going to be doing more videos like this. I don't know if I can make the YouTube thing work out, but it is an interesting learning experience. And I do want to keep making stuff, and I think the process of making things is cool to watch. I watch a lot of YouTubers who do videos like this. And when I start my next project, or when I start working on something else, I'll probably be doing more videos. So the goal right now is at least one video a week, so there will be more from here. But for now, this was opening up the Goblin Slayer mold and doing a casting. Turned out quite well, and maybe you learned something, maybe not. But appreciate you watching, and maybe I'll see you in the next video.